Perched on the western bank of the Potomac River, just south of the city of Alexandria, is one of the most famous landmarks in North America. It is Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, where he lived, often worked, and where he died in 1799. The house and surrounding buildings and grounds are a living museum, reflecting how he lived and worked in the late 18th century. To most, the name Mount Vernon refers to the mansion which overlooks the Potomac River, with its distinctive hipped roof, wide piazza, and impressive facade. In Washington's day, Mount Vernon referred to much more than just the house. A number of lucrative businesses operated on the over 8,000 acres which comprised Washington's estate. Mount Vernon included a fishery, with a small fleet of fishing boats which caught fish in the river. The fish were packed in salt for shipping in barrels to markets in the West Indies and other markets. A pier jutted into the river from the estate's shore, allowing vessels to dock and transfer goods to and from the land. Among the goods Washington shipped from Mount Vernon were woolens spun in the estate's looms from wool sheared from flocks on one of the estate's 5 separate farms. Hogs were raised on the estate, converted to pork, preserved by salting or smoking, and shipped to markets. Washington's gristmill converted his own crops as well as those from neighboring farms into flour and meal, another profitable enterprise. His several cash crops included hemp, flax, maize, rye, wheat. His orchards produced fruit for his table as well as for local markets. Mount Vernon's cooperages produced barrels from lumber cut from his trees and produced in his sawmill. Iron workers and blacksmiths turned out tools, including an innovative agricultural seed drill of Washington's own design. He developed a new method of using horsepower to thresh wheat, the feat of separating the grain from the stalk, and used it for his own crops as well as those who paid him to thresh their grain. By the time of Washington's death, Mount Vernon included what was then the largest by volume whiskey distillery in the United States, with his whiskey sold both in nearby taverns and in the West Indies. Mount Vernon was, by any standard, a major and diverse commercial enterprise, and though Washington would have been unaware of the term, adopted sustainable farming and manufacturing. At its height, well over 500 people lived and worked on the estate and its farms, with over half of them being enslaved. Washington didn't start Mount Vernon, though the property he took possession of in the mid-1750s was but a shadow of what he eventually created. He built the estate into what it became despite his many extended absences during the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, and his 2 terms as the first president. When he acquired the property, it was a small single-story 4-room house on lands exhausted by years of growing tobacco. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Larry Holsworth, so be sure to show them some love as you deploy your likes and do all the things that help keep the eldritch beast that is the YouTube algorithm going. Let's get to it. The original house at Mount Vernon was built by Augustine Washington, George's father, on land the family had owned since the late 17th century. Augustine called the house and surrounding plantation Little Hunting Creek, named after a smaller stream running through the property. The house was typical for that region of Virginia, roughly square and of wood construction, with large chimneys at each end accommodating fireplaces in each of the rooms. Augustine built the original house beginning in roughly 1733 through 34. The 4 rooms were not all of the same size. The kitchen was necessarily larger. The differing room sizes meant that the door was off-center when viewed from outside. In today's iteration of the Mount Vernon mansion, it still is. Augustine Washington died in 1743, and the plantation, including the house, was inherited by Lawrence Washington, George's elder half-brother. At the time of his father's death, Lawrence managed the Little Hunting Creek plantation, then about 2,000 acres of land, nearly all of it used to grow tobacco. Lawrence largely ignored the house, instead concentrating his efforts on buying additional land surrounding the Washington property in the hope that new ground would improve the dwindling tobacco harvests. Lawrence Washington served with the British Army in the West Indies during the so-called War of Jenkins' Ear in the early 1740s, under the command of British Admiral Edward Vernon. When Lawrence inherited the plantation from his father, he renamed it Mount Vernon in honor of his former commander. Lawrence married Anne Fairfax, the eldest daughter of one of Virginia's wealthiest and most prominent families. Together they had 4 children, though none survived infancy. Never healthy himself, Lawrence died in 1752 of tuberculosis. His wife inherited Mount Vernon, though she left the property returning to her family's estate at Belvoir, Virginia. George Washington leased the estate from Anne Fairfax, later purchasing it outright and enlarged the house by adding a second floor with a garret above the new rooms. The first expansion took place in the late 1750s, in part a preparation for his marriage to the widowed Martha Dandridge Custis. Visitors to Mount Vernon today are often surprised to learn that the house is built of wood rather than stone. Washington had the wood siding cut to resemble stone blocks, a theme which continued during later additional expansions of the main house and its outbuildings. As far as is known, no architect was involved in the design or construction of the house. Washington may have discussed his plans informally with various architects, but the design of the house appears to be his own. As Washington's wealth and social prominence grew in the 1760s and 1770s, he decided to expand his house again, beginning in 1774. He had a two-story wing constructed on the south side of the building. In 1776, though absent while serving as commander of the Continental Army, he had a similar wing built on the north side. The piazza, which runs the length of the original main house facing the Potomac, and the distinctive cupola were installed while Washington was away at war, supervised by his overseer, though Washington provided detailed instructions as to his desires for the appearance of his home. George Washington, no doubt with considerable input from his wife, decorated his home's interior in the manner then fashionable among the wealthier Virginia families. Ceilings featured decorative plasterwork, many of which were intricately detailed. Wallpapers and painted wall panels were found throughout the house. Furniture was often interchangeable between rooms, other than those set aside as family bedrooms, sitting rooms, or George's private study. In the North Side expansion, Washington created a single room with its ceiling 16.5 feet above the floor. Washington called the room his new room. He first saw the room in 1781, when he stopped at Mount Vernon on his journey to Yorktown during the Revolutionary War. Washington used this room for formal dining, dancing, or other large receptions. It is the largest room in the house and one of the best lit due to its large windows. In the opposite expansion on the first floor, Washington had his private study, a room which few visitors ever saw. Behind the study, a private staircase led to his bedchamber above. In addition to serving as his study, Washington kept his wardrobe in this room, bathed there, and dressed there. Washington kept the only known portrait of his half-brother Lawrence in this room as well. With the north end dominated by the new room and the south with Washington's private quarters, the family and guests spent most of their time inside the mansion in the rooms which had been part of the original house and the first expansion above. Mount Vernon was famous for its hospitality, and there were seldom times when guests were not present in the house, even during times when Washington was not present. In Washington's day, bold colors for paint and furniture upholstery were favored, and Washington's home reflected such taste. Vivid colors rather than muted were prominent throughout the house, kind of like Zack Snyder versus James Gunn. The necessities for the main house, kitchen facilities, and privies were built outside the dwelling, connected to the house via covered colonnades. The colonnades curved outside of the main house like arms surrounding a wide expanse of lawn and were known as Mansion Circle. The colonnades also connected to storage sheds, servants' quarters, a spring house, and other support buildings. The Potomac River provided a significant boost to the economy of Mount Vernon. Washington maintained a fleet of fishing boats which harvested fish from the river. The fish were cleaned and packed in salt both to feed the enslaved workers on the estate and for sale. Mount Vernon required a tremendous amount of salt for this endeavor, as well as to preserve other meats. Washington preferred to purchase his salt from merchants in Portugal, which he considered the best for his purposes. He also imported salt from the Mediterranean when his preferred salt was unavailable. Salt was expensive. That Washington was willing to spend more than he would have by purchasing domestic salt is an indication of the importance he assigned to his fishery and meatpacking interests. 3 separate fisheries eventually operated along the Potomac at Mount Vernon. They were an example of the frugality practiced at Mount Vernon. Nothing went to waste. Byproducts of processing the fish for packing were used for fertilizers. The fisheries were busiest during the early spring, when fish ran along the river just offshore. Washington's fisheries were the single most lucrative commercial activity at Mount Vernon, generating an income which exceeded that of all of his other businesses. Saltfish caught and packed at Mount Vernon were loaded into ships at the estate's own wharf and dispatched to markets in the West Indies and Europe, as well as 2 local markets. At its height, Mount Vernon had about 3,000 acres of land under cultivation divided into 5 separate farms. Washington named his farms Dog River Farm, Union Farm, Muddy Hole Farm, River Farm, and Mansion House Farm. In the mid-1750s, Washington largely abandoned tobacco as his main cash crop and replaced it with wheat. He also grew hemp and flax as cash crops. Rope made from quality hemp fiber was more pliable and less prone to rot than rope from other materials, and thus was in high demand from shipfitters and navies. Flax could be spun into linen thread, also a highly marketable item. Threshing wheat, that is, separating the usable grain from the stalk, was labor-intensive and wasteful. Historically, wheat was threshed either by flailing it on a hard surface or by treading it, literally using livestock or humans to walk over the stalks of wheat. To ease the task of threshing, Washington designed and had built a 16-sided threshing barn with 2 stories. The upper story was floored with boards with a small gap in between them. A ramp led from outside to the upper floor. The room below was equipped with a stone floor. The upper floor was then covered with harvested wheat. About 1 acre's worth of wheat could be loaded at one time. Horses were then led around the floor in a circular pattern, allowed by the 16-sided walls. As they treaded the wheat, the berries fell to the floor below, while most of the stalks remained behind. It took the trotting horses around 45 minutes to thresh an acre's worth of wheat, which was easily swept up from the dry stone floor below. Wheat offered Washington another potential product, that of flour. Rather than pay a gristmill to grind his wheat and other grains into flour or meal, Washington built his own gristmill on his Dog River farm around 1770. Its stone exterior walls enclosed the water wheel, which protected the wheel from the weather. Despite the water wheel being protected from the elements, other components of the mill system were not, and in times of drought or in the freezing conditions of winter, the mill could not operate. When it did operate roughly 6 to 9 months of the year, the mill was capable of grinding up to 8,000 pounds of flour per day, or roughly 3,000 pounds of cornmeal. When Washington was President of the United States in 1791, he reviewed a patent application for an improved automated milling system. He approved the patent and had his secretary contact the inventor with an eye to installing the system in his own mill. The inventor dispatched 2 of his brothers to install the system in Washington's gristmill that same year. The improved system, called an Evans automated system after its inventor, Oliver Evans, allowed Washington Gristmill to produce superfine flour from his wheat, which sold at premium prices and was valued as an export. The Evans system thereby allowed Washington to increase the profits from his gristmill and from the wheat crops he produced. In 1796, just before leaving the presidency, George Washington hired James Anderson, a Scot immigrant from Edinburgh, to serve as a farm manager at Mount Vernon. Anderson had extensive experience in such a role in both Scotland and Virginia, and being a Scot, he had experience in another use of grain besides the converting of it to flour. After establishing himself and his large family at Mount Vernon, Anderson approached Washington with the idea of building a whiskey distillery on Dog Farm, near the gristmill. Anderson presented the idea as one of using otherwise surplus grain as yet another source of income. Anderson began distilling operations in 1797, using a portion of the cooperage building and experimenting with different grain proportions. It was quickly evident that to be profitable, the distillery would require its own space. Construction of the distillery, using stone for a foundation and sandstone blocks quarried at Mount Vernon for its walls and floors, began in October 1797. The resulting building covered 2,250 square feet, sufficient to house 5 pot stills, and making it one of the largest distilleries then extant in America. 3 of the 5 stills were manufactured by a coppersmith in Alexandria. The origin of the other 2 are unknown. Together, the 5 stills held 616 gallons of mash. For a recipe, Anderson decided on 60% rye, 35% corn, and 5% malted barley. Zum whiskey was flavored, using among other flavorings cinnamon and maple sugar. Those who believe cinnamon-flavored whiskey to be a relatively recent innovation may be surprised to learn that Americans enjoyed its taste over 200 years ago. The distillery was also used to produce fruit brandies such as apple and peach. Washington's whiskey was barreled but not to age. The barrels were not charred, and they were used simply to convey the whiskey to market, usually in Alexandria. The whiskey left the barrel the same as it came out of the still, clear, uncolored, and raw, so I likely would not have liked it. It was closer to moonshine than to the finished rye whiskeys available today. Washington, with an eye on the remains of the distilling process, used the waste to feed his hogs. He had a hog pen built on Dog Farm near the distillery in 1798, and the animals thrived on the addition to their diet. Fatter hogs meant increased profits when the animals were shipped to meat packers to eventually become, among other things, Virginia hams. The distillery became so profitable that in 1799, Washington and Anderson began planning to expand its operation. That year, the distillery produced 11,000 gallons of whiskey. Like the flour from his grist mill, it was sold at different levels of quality based on the number of distillations it underwent during production. The least expensive, distilled twice, was called common whiskey and made up the bulk of production. Other, more expensive grades were distilled 4 times, and sometimes even more. Washington died suddenly at Mount Vernon in December 1799. At that time, his distillery, which had been in operation for less than 2 full years, was the largest producer of whiskey in the United States. The distillery ceased operations early in the 19th century. Anderson remained at Mount Vernon as farm manager until Martha Washington's death in 1802. By then, the distillery was in disrepair. In the 21st century, it was completely rebuilt and operates on the estate today, selling whiskeys which are far removed from those consumed by Washington's original customers, which means I would likely like those whiskeys. Near the main house, on the section of the property Washington called the Mansion House Farm, several small manufacturing and support facilities operated. Among them were a blacksmith shop, which also served as a locksmith shop. There, all of the myriads of tools and implements needed by the plantation's operations were manufactured or repaired. Mount Vernon went through barrels by the hundreds for fish, flour, whiskey, and virtually everything which was required to move. Coopers worked in the cooperage house, manufacturing barrels of varying sizes, but also manufacturing buckets and pails, rough furniture, rope blocks, and pulleys, and other wooden products. The wood consumed by the cooperage came from the wooden areas of the estate, often from trees selected by Washington himself. These were cut, stripped of bark, seasoned, and shaped by woodcutters, then stored in different locations on the property. Other important outbuildings included the smokehouse, where meats including some game were preserved and stored. A springhouse kept dairy products and some fruits cool, supplemented with an ice house. Of critical importance was the salt house, where Washington stored that precious commodity near the main house. Between the stables just south of the mansion and the mansion itself was the important outbuilding used as the wash house. Laundry from the mansion was washed there, including table lines, bed linens, and the clothing belonging to the Washingtons and their guests. Mount Vernon was a major employer in Northern Virginia, with workers including skilled artisans such as stonecutters, plasterers, blacksmiths, carpenters, sailors, weavers, and countless more. Many of these were hired by George Washington and his managers to help with operating the estate, the farms, the gardens, and the mansion. Yet, the overwhelming majority of the laborers and artisans at Mount Vernon were enslaved. How they lived depended on where on the plantation they worked and their roles in daily life. Those who worked in the fields on the farms occupied small one-room wooden cabins. For the most part, larger families occupied several cabins nearby each other. The enslaved field workers had small garden plots where they grew fruits and vegetables for their own consumption and which they sometimes sold at local markets. They were allowed to raise chickens both for consumption and for their eggs. Snares for rabbits and other small game likewise provided fresh meat in addition to their daily rations of salt fish, salt meat, and cornmeal. Skilled laborers were often hired out to other nearby concerns, and Washington allowed those to retain some of the money they were paid. How generous, I guess. Others were apprenticed to artisans in Alexandria and even as far away as Richmond to learn trades such as blacksmithing, locksmithing, carpentry, bricklaying, weaving, spinning, and sewing. Enslaved laborers spun thread from wool and flax grown on the estate to produce thread which was woven into cloth. The cloth was then sewn into clothes for the enslaved community as well as for sale to other plantations. The nets used by Washington's fisheries, indeed the boats which drew them, were manufactured by enslaved laborers. Most of the skilled artisans lived in dormitory-style structures on Mansion House Farm. Washington was a noted horseman throughout his life and maintained a stable of blooded horses for fox hunting and recreational riding, as well as matched teams for his carriage. The latter featured a uniformed driver driver, and footmen, all enslaved. So were the grooms, which cared for the horses in the stables in which they were kept. Enslaved workers who worked at the stables lived at or near the stables. Those in the private gardens lived near the gardens, or in the winter months in the elaborate greenhouse which Washington had built in the upper garden near the main house. The main house itself required a staff of no fewer than 10 workers, and if guests were present, as they usually were, many more. Visitors often brought with them their own servants, and these too had to be accommodated. Butlers, house servants, maids, cooks, and valets were present on every floor of the mansion, and lived either in the mansion's basement or in the quarters along the colonnades attached to the main house. Over the course of his lifetime, Washington came to detest the system of slavery present in the American South, though he failed to suggest solutions to rectify the situation. He believed blanket manumission or emancipation would damage both the former slaves and economy. He several times complained that there were more enslaved people at Mount Vernon than were needed to run the estate, but he refused to sell any and worried about their welfare if they were abruptly set free. At the time of his death, 317 enslaved people were at Mount Vernon, of which he was the legal owner of 123. The rest were either on loan from elsewhere or owned by the Custis estate, inherited by his wife. Legally, Washington could only free those 123, and he did so in his will, contingent upon the death of his widow. Following the death of Martha Washington in 1802, the plantation and house fell into decline. The estate fell into the hands of George Washington's nephew, Bushrod Washington, who lacked the funds to adequately operate and maintain the property. The property changed hands several times, with each succeeding Washington heir unable to maintain the property. The fisheries, gristmill, and distillery all fell into disuse. The mansion fell into disrepair. Tourists, curious about the first president's former home, often visited, taking with them what they desired when they left. In 1858, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association purchased the property, though the ensuing Civil War prevented them from doing much about its upkeep. Following the Civil War, which the mansion survived without significant damage, tourists began to visit regularly. Access was gained via steamboats, trolley service, electric railway, and eventually a paved road known today as the George Washington Memorial Parkway. Both George and Martha Washington are entombed at the estate, and it has become one of America's most popular historical sites and tourist destinations. Among the many notables who visited the site over the years are Queen Elizabeth II and her husband, Prince Philip, Winston Churchill, nearly every American president since George Washington, nearly innumerable foreign heads of state, and the National Hockey League Stanley Cup, which sat on George Washington's Bowling Green at Mount Vernon for a photo opportunity on October 5, 2018. Washington, a lifelong devotee of sport and exercise, likely would have welcomed the visit. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historical monument we haven't covered yet, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about history's most important locations. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time